Hari Om Namaha. The root issues of why and how Prabhupada's branch of the Hare Krishna movement was converted into an apāsa is analyzed every month in our presentations. This month, we shall shed more light upon that make-show, that apāsa known as so-called ISKCON. Today's analysis centers on dogma, pretension, and the avidyā feeding that dogma and pretension. It is a procedural avidyā before it gets turned into cult dogma. Once the dogma is believed, it continues to exacerbate a major institutional delusion in so-called ISKCON. Since the mid-'80s, this delusion is at the core of maintaining the cult's pretense of offering genuine gurus and genuine initiations, and we shall definitively specify what that delusion is coming up soon. People who are under the spell of so-called ISKCON, its version of Mahā-bhāgavats, mistake dogma for truth, and their progress in spiritual life is thus bollocksed. They push all of their chips into the center of the table. They're all in. Doing so, they identify with the deviated cult, and of course, they identify out of fanaticism. Once an unfortunate seeker of the absolute truth gets sucked into the cult's vortex, there's little chance to escape. There is dogma in so-called ISKCON, and it serves as the mortar to hold the ISKCON wonder wall together. It works to keep each of its countless so-called initiated disciples in illusion, adrift without a spiritual rudder. Although there are exceptions, for the most part, that dogma covers over the fringes as well. The air quotes ISKCON narrative of what went down since Prabhupada's disappearance, that narrative is deeply flawed. Yet its dedicated followers, all with a poor fund of knowledge and meager discriminatory power, are unable to realize this fact. The dogma, buttressed by unsound sentiments, was promulgated aggressively during the heady Zonal Ācārya era. Because that particular broken arrow, which we rightly term the first transformation, because it derailed the bhakti train from the tracks at very high speed, it soon enough led to an intense internecine war within the organization. We've been discussing that contentiousness in our recent presentations, and we shall continue to do so this month. Rationalizing dogma becomes easy as long as even a couple of major misconceptions are believed to be true by everyone in the occult institution. So-called ISKCON is just such an institution under just such a universal spell. Undeniably, massive, mind-boggling pretension was at the heart of the horrible Zonal Ācārya era. Yet, so-called ISKCON is warping the actual historical narrative when it promulgates the belief, self-serving belief, that pretension disappeared after the temple presidents via the Guru Reform movement led by Ravindra Swarup finally got over in 1987. He and his comrades spread the illusion that they had overcome pretension after the 11 great pretenders along with a handful of later editions, were all busted down, allegedly busted down from Uttama to Madhyam. Although it's not so. We'll get into that. In the course of the zonal pretense, all of Ocean's 11 had taken constant, exalted worship as so-called mahā-bhāgavats. It was utterly undeserved. The temple presidents finally triumphed, and when they did, they believed that they were justified to then carry on the organization via a new dispensation, which allegedly was unimpeded by all those who had previously imitated Prabhupada. However, although it's mostly unrecognized, pretension remained in their new paradigm, and we're going to describe it. What it did was morph into an imitation which was and is different at the outer circles, but not at the core. As the outrageous zonal era segued into the contentious mid-80s, some air quotes ISKCON leaders, and even some rank-and-file devotees, began to think that the godmen supposedly appointed by Prabhupada's Diksha gurus and worshipped as madhyama-adhikārīs on lavish seats in front of open deities in temple rooms, that those godmen did not deserve all of that hype and adulation. The developing Internecine war was then in its incipient stage, and those who would become its stalwarts on the reform side of the coin, led by Ravindra, of course, in particular, could not fail to see signs that the leaders at the top echelon of so-called ISKCON, those high-flying gurus, were anything but expert in spiritual science. How could they be? If they were expert, then that schism with Gaudiya Math would not have and could not have transpired. Remember, so-called ISKCON relied heavily on Gaudiya Math, one of its prominent leaders in particular, for what was implemented in the zonal imposition during that incipient stage. By 1984, that scheme was floundering, and it would flounder more and more in 85, 86 also. Actual experts in the knowledge of cause and effect, what to speak of spiritual science, could not have drafted or implemented anything for the movement that would make it wind up so soon in such dire straits. Real transcendental experts, on the other hand, produce successful results according to a plan which is in accordance with providence, higher destiny. What was the result of the zonal era? It would not have collapsed if it had produced excellent or even good results in spreading pure Krishna consciousness, if it was actually guided by very perfect men. It didn't. It wasn't. And it cratered under the weight of its own contradictions. Spiritual master in so-called ISKCON was, and still is, determined by the vitiated GBC, the Governing Body Commission. As such, all of the post-Prabhupada gurus are institutional gurus. This includes the 11 great pretenders who kicked off that massive show battle. In the late 70s and first half of the 80s, they were expert only in playing the governing body and climbing the lattice work of the bureaucracy. They were trained and ruthless cult manipulators, granted, but more than this was needed in order to prevail during that fierce Internecine war which they seeded. In our ongoing review of 11 Naked Emperors by Henry Doktorski, henceforward referred to as ENE, its acronym, we have now reached chapter 13. Mostly it centers around that fateful year of 1987. Last month we covered 1986, which was the full emergence of the war. The appropriate title of ENE Chapter 13 this month is, quote, Fall of the Zonal Ācāryas, unquote. It details how compromise reform got over and successfully busted down the so-called madhyama-adhikārīs to the alleged status of madhyama-adhikārīs. The great pretenders who did not manifest egregious fall downs during this new, air quotes, ISKCON transformation, namely those who cooperated with compromise reform, were now supposed to be seen as madhyama-adhikārīs, but they were nowhere near that level. Directly related to this truth will be the, air quotes, ISKCON dogma manifested in the form of a major misconception, avidyā, about the spiritual science of bhakti yoga. Just as importantly, like the zonal imposition, that major misconception housed a pretense. It was dependent upon pretension. So-called ISKCON since 1987 has been dependent upon its loyalists fully buying into this particular avidyā. We shall specify it. It is the not-so-hidden linchpin of what afforded the second transformation to gain needed traction in order to last as long as it did, which was not very long. In 1987, TKG removed his Vyasasans from all the centers in his zones, indicating that he should only be shown the respect due to a madhyama-adhikārī. He gave up the pretense of being a God-realized mahā-bhāgavats, and it was an effective move. He knew which way the wind was blowing, and he acted accordingly. The chief scribe of the cult also almost immediately followed his lead, having indicated even previous to it that he no longer wanted to be seen and worshipped as an uttama-adhikārī. In the same time frame, ENE reveals that Ācāryas, delegating his power and autocratic style to his own men in his own zone, transitioned 4 new gurus there in his zone from sannyasi and brahmachari. In other words, he made them gurus. This was an unprecedented move, part and parcel of the reactions which were breaking bad for the zonals who did not want to be ostracized after being busted down. The gurus who were most shrewd made the necessary adjustments, setting the stage for compromise reform to prevail in the spring of 1987 at Māyāpur. Now, as a side note, in the 60s, politically inclined hippies rejecting the host culture in America, which the vast majority of them did, often turned to Marxism as their positive alternative, and all of them were located in urban centers, particularly in New York City. They concluded amongst themselves that the struggle against capitalism was not how the final battle against the most potent enemy would ensue. In other words, the battle against capitalism would be won before that. As such, their infighting was fierce because they all believed that the final fight would be between socialism and communism. Similarly, the writing was on the wall in early 1987. The battle with the high-flying gurus was not the essence of this internecine war within so-called ISKCON. The battle against status quo and status quo modified still had to be fought to its destined end, but it was clear how it would play out and which party would win. Reform would triumph, and that became more and more self-evident by the day. Instead, the essential battle was, in 1987, between compromise reform and radical reform. E&E describes this as follows, quote, "The radical reformers argued that ISKCON should return to square one, to the time before the Zonal Ācāryas took office after Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupāda's disappearance. They advocated making all previous initiations by the Zonal Ācāryas null and void. They said that all of the thousands of disciples of the new gurus should be notified that their initiations had been conducted under false pretenses, that they had actually not received initiation into the sampradaya. The radical reformers also insisted that the Zonal Ācāryas who had taken over the GBC in 1978 and who were still in office, Jayapataka, Bhavananda, Hridayananda, Satsvarup, Harikesh, Tamal Krishna, Rameshvara, Bhagavan, and Kirtanananda, that they should all be stripped of their guruship and disciplined. For nearly a decade, the reformers claimed, these pretenders, with the authorization of the GBC, had instituted their own totalitarian regime and persecuted the actual Brahmins in ISKCON, such as Pradyumna, Yashodanandan, Kailasa Chandra, and others, who had so bravely tried to confront the charlatans and keep Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupāda's movement on track." Unquote. In the same time frame, one of the three gurus initially expanded from Ocean's 11, when it shared the franchise for the first time in 1982, chastised the vitiated GBC. E&E offers part of his critique as follows, quote, "An ISKCON guru and GBC member, Panchadravida Swami, who had been ordained as a guru in 1982, advocated removing every single GBC member and electing entirely new members. All the leaders, including himself, he claimed, had a hand in corruption. Panchadravida Swami explained, I want to apologize to the devotees for what I consider was a great injustice perpetrated over the last 9 years. As a GBC and guru, I can't absolve myself of responsibility for many of the injustices that devotees have experienced for the last 9 years. ISKCON underwent a shift from being a very scientific and scripturally presented movement to a personality cult. We established elaborate worship of ordinary persons. We've worshiped people who are more astute politically than spiritually. By establishing that kind of worship for persons who aren't pure, we diminish Prabhupada's position," unquote. In 1987, the wheels were coming off, but the vitiated GBC would not be converted to reform without a fight. Their corruption was being exposed by insiders. But the point man here, Panchadravida, had to be punished. It expelled him from so-called ISKCON in the spring of 1987. As a result, he soon joined the fledgling Neomat adversary. As noted previously, the insurgents in so-called ISKCON became commonly known as the Guru Reform Movement. Ironically, this anomalous title would be modified and adapted less than a decade later by one of the Ritvik groups. The Guru Reform movement of late 1986 wanted to establish a committee in order to check the power of the vitiated GBC. Astonishingly, they were able to do just that in the last month of 1986 and had quite the bite during the fateful next year, as per E&E, quote, "Finally, after nearly 3 years of struggle, the Guru reformers constituted a formidable force against the Guru-controlled GBC. A 50-man committee consisting of temple presidents, sannyasis, and other senior Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada disciples, all of whom opposed the Zonal Ācāryas, was formed at the December 1986 North American GBC meeting in Dallas, Texas. Tamal Krishna Goswami was elected chairman. Besides being ambitious and determined, Tamal Krishna was a superb administrator and a political strategist. He saw the fall of the Zonal Ācāryas coming, and in an effort to retain as much power as possible, he jumped ship to join the side he thought would win, the Guru reformers," unquote. Remember, the temple presidents had the Gurus by the short hairs. The Gurus were big-time enjoyers. They exploited more psychophysical pleasure than anyone else in the world because they received so much adulation, not afforded to anyone else in the world anywhere. They obviously needed to keep their disciples in the, air quotes, ISKCON institutional system, if for no other reason than to be able to secure a portion of the pick their men and women brought in daily. It was up to the temple presidents to train, this word we're using in a loose sense here, obviously. It was up to them to train thousands of new people, keeping them loyal to so-called ISKCON. Such loyalty necessarily entailed adherence to their gurus, supposedly on the highest level of purity and realization. E&E describes more about the Guru Reform movement and its 50-man committee in the Showdown at Māyāpur, 1987, quote, "The 50-man committee dominated the agenda at the 1987 GBC meetings in Māyāpur. The committee discussed a suggestion that the entire GBC resign and new members be elected, but it was rejected, quote unquote, due to the consideration that Śrīla Prabhupāda's mood was more to reform someone than to throw him out, unquote." However, the 50-man committee succeeded in suspending the GBC, an amazing feat, unquote. Now, I was not privy to any of that. I was already made radioactive by that time. But what I've heard through the grapevine, the committee targeted the most powerful of the gurus, which was the right tactic in order for their strategy, which was to overthrow the zonals, to succeed. Although it is not mentioned in E&E, your host speaker heard through the grapevine that they jettisoned Hridayananda first, and he was very resentful about it when later reinstated. However, the committee had its own momentum checked when it came to attacking Hrishikesh, because he was very influential and wealthy. He threatened to start his own movement. It appeared that he could pull Central and Eastern Europe completely out of the so-called ISKCON sphere, so the committee had to back off when it came to him. Nevertheless, please note that the Guru Reform movement being able to suspend the GBC, no matter for how short the length of time it was, is mind-boggling. Prabhupada did this in the first half of April 1972, and 15 years later it was done again. These suspensions proved, and still prove, that the GBC was never endowed with absolute power. If it was, it could never have been suspended or checked in that way. The GBC was supposed to be the ultimate managing authority in the movement. But it only held that status for as long as it remained bona fide. By 1987, it had been severely deviated for at least 9 years. It was never the ultimate spiritual authority, although it appeared to be by its actions of appointing or not vetoing or voting in spiritual masters through ever-changing ecclesiastical devices, reed concoctions. Chapter 13 devotes substantial font space to the North American Temple presidents and their meeting in Tawako, New Jersey, just prior to Māyāpur 1987. There's almost no record of it, because they wanted it that way. Their penchant for secrecy has been assimilated by them from their leaders at the top echelon. However, some information about that Jersey mini-conclave did leak out and finally surface. We're simply going to summarize it. It marked the final battle between compromise reform and radical reform. One of the chief leaders of the latter group did not attend, and that contributed in a major way to the outcome. Ravindra and his comrades, the Bolsheviks, prevailed against the Mensheviks. Not only did they prevail by their numbers, but the most powerful scholar, Ravindra, was on their side. In chapter 13, what went down in this smaller battle within the bigger battle was analyzed by a former disciple of Hansaduta as follows. Quote, according to the compromise, the remaining zonals would keep the disciples they had acquired under the blatant lie that they had been appointed by Śrīla Prabhupāda, and a number of Guru Reform movement leaders like Ravindra Swarup Das and Ācārya Rishi Das would abandon any appearance of principle by also joining the make-show as an ecclesiastical guru. This Machiavellian pragmatism is unfortunately how things often get done in the GBC. It isn't trying to do what is pure or even according to Śrīla Prabhupāda. Although his instructions are selectively invoked, when the going gets tough, it is too often what is going to keep the powerful in power and keep the mass of devotees bewildered about how the GBC really does things, so that they'll be able to keep producing the results of new members and income of money. In this way, the blatant abuses and deviations of the zonal Ācāryas were only replaced by a lesser evil. The remaining zonals, who had the real power of many so-called disciples and temples, were forced to come down a notch or two and largely surrender the movement's management. Then the new bosses painted a new face on the fading patient by ostracizing the more strident reformers, quieting the more dependent with assurances of righting the wrongs, and ushering in a less autocratic, collegial, far more Western and warm and fuzzy ISKCON, unquote. And all of this was courtesy of Professor Blueblood. It is virtually certain that he had been in consultation with some of the air quotes ISKCON leaders still backing the original gurus. By Tawako, at least two of them, and we've mentioned them already, had signaled a willingness to accept a compromise. Ravindra proposed that compromise with arguments against rejecting post-Prabhupada initiations. He warned that the schism it would cause was not worth the solution it would produce, and the majority bought into that argument. Radical reform lost at Tawako. As such, the new Guru Reform movement came into Māyāpur in 1987 with a strong and united momentum. They came in free from the radicals formerly in their group because the few who still believed in radical reform no longer had a runway. The torch was passed to a new transformation, a new concoction. 4 prominent sannyasis, embroiled in scandals, and all initiating gurus and influential members of the vitiated GBC either resigned or were removed from office. Damage control was still in vogue at that 1987 Māyāpur conclave, which would pass many resolutions. The second transformation of so-called ISKCON was now the wave of the future. But for how long would its collegiate compromise last? And what was it really based upon? You will receive those answers. What may surprise some of you is that at root, it was based upon the same things the first transformations of the Zonal Ācārya scheme was based upon. It was based upon both institutionalism, in an even stronger way than during the Zonal era, and it was still based upon pretension. The pretension of cutting obnoxious mahā-bhāgavat profiles employed by the Zonals was eradicated. However, it was replaced by another pretension. Tattvamasi. It was based upon the idea that the Zonals institutionally being busted down to madhyama-adhikārī, that this actually qualified them as being madhyams. In point of fact, they had no such qualification. It was based upon the pretension that all of those initiating gurus added to the cult in the 80s were madhyams. None of those pretenders were madhyams. It has always been a pretension that they were madhyams. None of them were anywhere near being genuine madhyama-adhikārīs. Since the mid-80s, it has been integral to, air quotes, ISKCON dogma that its gurus are madhyams. There is no substance to that whatsoever. Since then, they have all been pretender madhyama-adhikārīs. A madhyama-adhikārī initiated by Prabhupada can become a Diksha guru only if he receives Prabhupada's order to initiate new disciples. A madhyama-adhikārī is an advanced transcendentalist. We shall discuss this in detail later in our presentation. And, most importantly, a madhyam guru is never an institutional guru. And now, here are some of those resolutions I mentioned that were passed in 1987 at Māyāpur. 1. Kirtanananda Swami was expelled and henceforward forbidden to participate in any ISKCON functions. 2. Pavananda had his status as Diksha Guru suspended. Again. 3. Bhagavan and Rameshvara, each no longer recognized as a Swami but in the resolution referred to as Das, were suspended as ISKCON gurus. 4. Only Prabhupada's Vyasa-san was allowed in any ISKCON temple. 5. The only Guru Puja allowed would be for Prabhupada. 6. ISKCON gurus could not be worshipped by their disciples in the temples. 7. Honorific titles for gurus could not be used in public forums. 8. The term ācārya could no longer be used for any ISKCON gurus. And 9. Only Prabhupada's names would be chanted, Prabhupada's name would be chanted in temple kirtans. Your host speaker is quoted as follows in chapter 13. Quote, on the other hand, the radical reformers were saddened by what they saw as the victory of ecclesiasticalism and the defeat of philosophy. Kailasa Chandra noted, quote, sahajiyas cannot be allowed to keep their so-called initiated disciples if they superficially clean up their act. Pretender mahā-bhāgavats cannot retroactively be accorded the status of advanced devotees and know it for a fact that any Vaishnava madhyama-adhikārī is an advanced devotee simply because they jack down the opulence of their worship and say that their godbrothers and godsisters are no longer obliged to also serve and love them as gurus, unquote. E quotes Yashodanandan Prabhu, an important initiated disciple of Prabhupada and formerly a very influential sannyasi, as follows, quote, the current GBC still maintains as members some of the unrepentant architects of the Zonal Ācārya system. And yet we're being told that a reform took place in 1986, 1987, and that everything is back to normal. I question whether or not this was a merely cosmetic reform, while some of the masterminds and unrepentant architects merely toned down their style, even though their ācārya ambitions had been clearly unmasked. Is the GBC of our movement really serious about reestablishing the much-needed integrity of its board? Or are we to sadly conclude that it is simply the same old boys network with a different gloss, unquote. E quotes Nityananda Prabhu, a powerful disciple of Prabhupada, who single-handedly opened the New Orleans Yatra in the 60s as follows, quote, many senior devotees are not at all satisfied with the meager repentances that followed after the fall of the absolute gurus in 1987. From what I have seen, only Satsvarup Maharaj genuinely regrets his involvement with the GBC Guru era of 1978-1987. As far as I know, there was little to no public repentance for what a few powerful GBC gurus did to nearly destroy Prabhupada's movement. Some of them are now gone, and some of them are still here, unquote. Actually, there's been a complete turnover in the GBC since 1987. As far as functioning gurus from that time are concerned, there are only a handful left. Why? Because time changes things. And then we have the ISKCON Shastric Advisory Council, which is quoted in E to have warned, quote, we should also be aware from the history of other sampradayas and religions of the real danger of gradual corruptions. Even if apparent purity were maintained for some time by a bureaucratic regulating system of authorization, the eternal temptations of misusing the status of guru for self-aggrandizement could ruin the system and the institution. In future generations, we, like other sampradayas, could become burdened with gurus who collect disciples mainly for money and power. Such corruption could occur even while maintaining the external appearance of bureaucratic purity, unquote. Of course, as if there is such a thing as bureaucratic purity. E in chapter 13, at its very conclusion, shares the following analysis by Dhaneshwar Swami, a genuinely initiated disciple of Prabhupada and today a very influential preacher. Quote, as the highest authority of ISKCON, Śrīla Prabhupāda was final arbiter, decision maker. His decisions on all matters were the final word. In Śrīla Prabhupāda's last will and testament, he wrote that the GBC would be the ultimate managing authority for the entire society, just as Śrīla Prabhupāda was during his manifest presence. There's nothing wrong with that. However, again, this title, form, has been misrepresented by the GBC, mistaking this phrase to mean they are both the ultimate managers and the ultimate authority. Thus, they think they can do with ISKCON as they see fit, creating substance, while disregarding Śrīla Prabhupāda's earlier statements of what ISKCON is meant to be, forgetting that their authority stems from him even to this day. They interpret their title to mean that they're equal to Śrīla Prabhupāda himself, even stating that whatever they say is as if Śrīla Prabhupāda himself had said it. And beyond that, through this idea of being the ultimate authority, they attempt to create siddhanta, spiritual principles, contradicting long-established Gaudiya siddhanta. Thus, many of their laws are simply dogma. The most glaring example of this is their idea that all gurus connected with ISKCON must be subordinate to their control, ignoring the fact that the bona fide guru must be a transcendental autocrat. The GBC have failed in every respect to carry out Śrīla Prabhupāda's instructions to themselves and for his mission. They have taken charge of Śrīla Prabhupāda's ISKCON as if it were their own to do with what they please, rather than acting as fiduciaries, carefully protecting what Śrīla Prabhupāda had entrusted to them, and are in fact acting in opposition to Śrīla Prabhupāda's direct instructions, unquote. Now, as you may have noticed, Thanishvar brought up dogma in his analysis. Dogma was also mentioned at the beginning of this month's presentation. We are, of course, only referring to, air quotes, ISKCON dogma. Along with it, continuing pretension was also mentioned earlier. The dogma that replaced the pretension of the first transformation, of the massive deviation of the Zonal Ācāryas and all of the hell it brought to everyone, that dogma relied upon and continues to rely upon the following procedural avidyā: the dumbing down of madhyama-adhikārī. We find the description of madhyama-adhikārī in teachings of Lord Kapila. Tuj Joshanad, Ashvabarga Vartmani, Shraddha, Rutir, Bhoktir, Anu Kramashyati. Cultivating that transcendental knowledge, one quickly advances on the path of liberation. Firm faith, attraction, and devotion will follow in order. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 25, Text 25, the verse itself. Quote, one who has firm faith in the Supreme Personality of Godhead becomes fixed. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 25, Text 25, purport. Also in teachings of Lord Kapila, we find the following commentary. Quote, the madhyama-adhikārī wants to see that not a moment is wasted without engagement in Krishna consciousness. He is always careful not to spoil life's valuable time. This is the first qualification of a madhyama-adhikārī, unquote. The komala shraddha of the neophyte is not being described here. What is being described is praudha shraddha, firm faith. This is the beginning of madhyama-adhikārī. The madhyam is an advanced guru. He is automatically a shiksha guru and a vartma pradarshaka guru as soon as he reaches this advanced stage of madhyam. which entails real Shraddha. Firm faith means fixed faith. It means being fixed in Buddha Yoga. An advanced transcendentalist in the Bhakti line has this fixation at the very beginning of Madhyam. He progresses from there. You can pick up that he is advanced and perfectly self-controlled by his vibration. He is a special man. The Guru is a very perfect man. The madhyama-adhikārī is a very perfect man. The Uttama is more advanced, but the Madhyam can never be compared to the neophyte, who is not qualified to be Guru and who is not a perfect man. The real path to perfection, as evidenced in the verse quoted above, begins at real Shraddha, which is firm faith. The institutional Guru is never fixed. Institutional Guru means bogus Guru. He's a hired hand. He's a worker. He's been employed by the governing body. Organized religion, when it enters into the outer level of bhakti, and that level is not bona fide, produces fake madhyams. It produces fake gurus, who are all institutional gurus. That is all you get in so-called ISKCON, and such has been the case since the mid-'80s. Realize this. Previous to that, you only got fake uttamas, which was more outrageous. That pretense broke down badly in about 8 years. Yet, as mentioned previously, the pretense simply transferred itself to fake madhyams, appointed, or not vetoed, or forced to wait in queue to be approved to be institutional gurus by the corporation that controls them, that hires them, the vitiated GBC. Always remember that the vitiated GBC has its fingerprints all over the transformations which surfaced out of the ocean of nescience and became intrinsic to the air quotes ISKCON movement. Oceans 11 were all governing body commissioners. They're all implicated to the max. The zonal imposition was overturned by the vitiated GBC after having first authorized it. The collegiate compromise was engineered by the vitiated GBC. Professor Blueblood was appointed to the vitiated GBC in 1987, and wouldn't you know, the very next year, Ravindra Swarup was elected chairman of the governing body. Since the manifestation of the second transformation, the dumbing down of Madhyam has become procedural avidyā in that cult. It manifests as so-called ISKCON dogma in the form of the belief that so-called ISKCON must always have gurus. In point of fact, it has never had any gurus. Its so-called initiated disciples are all cheated, and they're all improperly initiated. The so-called Madhyams of so-called ISKCON are now the cult's primary cheaters. Quote, "We have created this GBC, so they should be very responsible men. Otherwise, they will be punished. They will be punished to become a Shudra." Although Yamaraj is a GBC, he made a little mistake. He was punished to become a Shudra. So those who are GBCs, they should be very, very careful to administer the business of ISKCON, otherwise they will be punished, unquote. Genuine gurus are never punished, but bogus gurus are always punished. A genuine madhyama-adhikārī, if he is ordered by Prabhupada to initiate disciples, he'll not cheat them. As such, they will not develop resentment against him. They will recognize that he is an advanced man who, unless he becomes fully God-realized, can only provide insufficient guidance. In the absence of any genuine madhyama-adhikārīs in the Western world, the recourse, the ashram, is the book Bhagavat. Quote, there are two types of Bhagavats, namely the book Bhagavat and the devotee Bhagavat. Both the Bhagavats are competent remedies, and both of them, or either of them, can be good enough to eliminate the obstacles. Bhagavat book and person are identical, unquote. The Ācārya, capital A, the Ācārya in the true sense of the term is the real transcendental autocrat. The disciple of that transcendental autocrat follows in his footsteps. He does not imitate him. From that perspective, and in that sense, the disciple's direction is as good as that of the Ācāryas, capital A. In other words, the Madhyam is an Ācārya as a regular guru. Quote, when I order you become guru, he becomes regular guru, that's all. He becomes disciple of my disciple, that's it. Prabhupada wanted all of his men to become regular gurus. He expected this from his leaders in particular. When the pronoun he is used for the first time in this concise quote, which I just gave, it refers to Prabhupada's initiated disciple being a regular guru. When that pronoun is used, the pronoun he is used for the second time, it refers to the newcomer who that regular guru initiates. Prabhupada wanted regular gurus. They are, by quality and definition, all madhyama-adhikārīs, and thus they are all very perfect men. They are like monitors in class. They're like teaching assistants working under the professor, the ācārya, capital A, to guide newcomers up the ladder of devotional service through perfect spiritual science. The man who has attained nishtha in Buddha Yoga can certainly guide his initiated disciples to his same stage of mind control, which is advanced. To sum it all up, stop dumbing down madhyama-adhikārī. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. It is loaded with dogma. It is loaded with avidyā. Its gurus are still sahajiyas, just not as blatant in their actions as they were in the previous pretenders. Pretension has not at all been eradicated or extricated from so-called ISKCON. Sadeva Samya.